Cool. All right. Welcome back to Deep Astrology. I think this is our sixth one, right?
Something like that.
Something like
We had
that.
a big gap, but we're
Yeah,
back
yeah,
now.
yeah. Been busy, very busy.
So do you want
Um,
to kick things off? Do you have like a topic to start us with?
yeah, I do. But I actually was interested in kind of what you were just saying, um, some of it regarding people, there being more than just a natal chart. We could actually make a
Yeah, I
good.
was going to say it's just one of the things that's like it's interesting because I think it's a real, just shows the perspective that you're looking from. I think it's always really important to understand that you're always looking from a particular perspective, and that perspective is going to influence how you see things. And it's what seems natural and obvious to you is really a function of perspective. And that's true of me, as much as anybody else. So, when people are coming to astrology, usually they're coming up from a perspective of they're interested in finding out about themselves. And so what they're introduced to for the first time is usually natal astrology, and it's modern
Right,
natal astrology.
right,
And so in that, when you're looking at a natal chart of a person, every house is significant. I mean, every house represents something in relation to that person. And if you're doing psychological, you're basically looking at, for example, the second house is your feelings about money. Fourth house is your feelings about your family, things like that. So, you look at everything. But that's what's interesting about that is that that's only one possible way of applying that. Because if you think about it, a chart is the universal picture of the heavens at that moment for that particular time, date, place. So everything that happens, everything in the cosmos on the earth is going to be somehow represented by the chart. And so what we look at is going to vary. Now, a good example of that is a horary question. So if you ask a horary question, you're not going to look at the entire chart. You're only going to look at the relevant houses. So for example, you say, well, I marry X. You're going to look at the first house that represents the querent asking the question. The seventh house represents the person that you're asking about. The ruler of each of those houses is the primary significator of that person. And we're going to look to that to see, like, if you're weak and they're strong, maybe they're more dominant in a relationship. If they're separating, then it's more negative for a relationship. They're coming together, that's more positive. I mean, but you're not going to be looking at the 12th house, for example. You're not going to be looking at the third house. You're going to focus on it. It's the same thing with elections. When you do electional astrology, when you're trying to pick a time for something, again, you're going to look at very specific houses and very specific signification. And so what you're recognizing there is that there are different ways of looking at each of a chart and different ways of approaching it. And so, what happens, like I said, a good example of this that again I find, just because of my perspective coming from a horary and electional perspective as well as the natal, is prescribing talismans for the natal chart. Now we don't basically have any guidance about this from our traditional sources. I mean, there's I mentioned in Picatrix that if a planet's strong in your natal chart, you're going to be better at contacting it. I mean, that would make sense that like if your Jupiter's strong, that you could use Jupiter talismans, but it doesn't say that specifically. So basically what everybody's done is kind of tried to put together more or less a methodology for prescribing talismans. Now, what I do, this is just my own idiosyncratic way, is to say, okay, let's look at your natal chart. Let's look at the essential dignity and debility. Okay, so not the house placement, not the aspects, basically nothing but the sign, exaltation, triplicity, term and face, and then detriment and fall, and then also look at retrogradation and combustion. So that's it. If it's unafflicted, if it's peregrine or dignified, then you have a good relationship with that spirit, with that celestial, with Mars or whatever to start with. If it's afflicted, then it's like, well, you just don't really get along with them so well. And so generally, the experience that I've had and other people reported to me is that if you use a talisman of a planet that's strong in your chart, you're going to get a really strong positive reaction. If it's unafflicted, it's fine. If it's afflicted, then it's very unpredictable. It's not like it's instant death. It's just that, you never know, because people get good effects, but some people have maybe a negative effect from it. And I've had some students that were, sort of spiritually inclined. They work with talismans of planets that are afflicted in natal chart. They had difficulties, but they said, no, that was useful spiritually. It was useful for my spiritual path. So
right.
that's
Hmm.
sort of my experience. Now, what I would say about that is that's not like this is the truth, and this is the methodology. It's just this is my idiosyncratic method. This is what I come up with, and this is what I based it on. And other people have other ways of doing it.
Right. I mean, I have some experience and know just firsthand that there are people, you know, who do Indian astrology, as people call it, Vedic, with prescribing the gemstones for astrological remedial treatment and such, right? And they seem to do it in a way which is very analogous to what you've always done, strong and dignified planets.
But see, other people will say if the planet's afflicted in your chart, you should definitely use the talisman of that planet.
That's the thing, that there is some of that too, depending. And also
but again, I'm not
yeah. And also, of course, their system's different than, they don't really have afflictions in the same way, you know what I mean? Like
I think they do have afflicted planets.
They do, but it's not exactly as it is in the West, for instance, like I'm trying to think, like a Mars in Libra, right? And the equivalent in Jyotish is not necessarily considered bad because it's opposite the Aries.
They have bad stuff.
They do. Oh yeah, certainly. For instance, yeah.
Unlike modern, see, it's like
right.
So this is what goes back to my point, which is that definitely when it comes to prescribing talismans for natal charts, nobody can come and say this is right. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's just definitely an area. There's not even, particularly at least in Western. I mean, Vedic might have traditional sources stuff, but in Westerns, it's wide open. So what people tend to do, though, and this is what I'm talking about perspective, is to say, okay, I know modern astrology, or they don't even say that, astrology. So I know astrology, which is modern natalist, psychological natal astrology. Say, okay, so I looked at my natal chart. So it makes sense to them to look at the natal chart of the talisman. Right?
So to clarify for people, what Chris means is, the chart that's constructed that reflects when the talisman has been created.
Exactly.
The chart of
they
the
analogize
talisman.
that to the birth chart. Right.
Right.
And so then what they'll do is say, oh, look, there's Leo's in the third house there, and or like Pluto's in the third house of the talisman. I don't like that chart. I don't like it. And it's like, part of the thing about it is that comes from synastry, which is comparing, two people's charts to get a sense of how these people interact. The problem with that is that a talisman's not a person. A talisman doesn't have brothers and sisters. It doesn't have children. It doesn't have illnesses. It doesn't have friends. It doesn't have secret enemies. It doesn't have a career. I mean, it's just really not at all analogous to that. It doesn't fit perfectly. And I mean, maybe it is or maybe it doesn't, but it's like, it just doesn't, you're going to have to redo everything or not. I mean, the other thing that I would say about it is that, you could go ahead and maybe have a methodology like that, but I don't think the typical modern methodology is no methodology. There's about 50 different possible things that they can do, and they just sort of randomly pop up. It's not like they have a checklist of 5 factors that they're looking at or a specific methodology, but basically it's just sort of like a intuitive kind of thing. Like, oh, look at that. I had somebody say to me, that was interested in an Algol talisman, which is a fixed star.
Mm-hmm.
That's for protection. And she said, well, I took my husband and in my chart and melded them. I forget what the technique was, like a midpoint, like the midpoints of my husband's and my chart, and that Algol was sextile the midpoint. And I was just like, what the fuck? I mean, it just seemed to me to be so far-fetched in terms of like, there's an infinite number of techniques and there's an infinite number of relating that. Because what people are looking for is really for reassurance. They're like, tell me everything's going to be okay. And if they can find these whatever connections in the chart, then they're like, oh, this, like people are always asking me, should I get this Jupiter talisman or that Jupiter talisman? And with my method, you can't differentiate between the Jupiter. It's like Jupiter's good for you, They want to be like, which is the best for me? And I'm like, I don't know.
I understand what you're saying. It's
very unsatisfying for people. It'd be better for sales if I would just be like, this is it. This is the greatest talisman in the world. And people would really feel comfortable and reassured, and they would buy that. And that we could, it's one of those things where there's a tacit conspiracy, right? You don't call me on your shit and I won't call you on my shit. And then we can all be happy. But to my mind, it's like, I can't do that with people because I'm like, no, I have to be honest. There really isn't any difference that I can point to that's going to be, because we don't know what's going to happen. That's what I'm saying. When you get a talisman, you can't predict the effects. And so it's probably going to be within the planetary rulership of it. That Jupiter has certain effects, it has a certain range of things it does. So the Jupiter talisman will probably be within range, but what it will be specifically, I don't know. And so
I get what you're saying. Yeah. I mean, on the other hand, just, we could always have to be open-minded in that if people are, empirically trying to test stuff out and it involves hitherto unexplored techniques or whatever, and it seems to work for them, good for them, but
I mean,
what
that's the
you
ultimate. I
know
was going to say is that ultimately, as cranky
that's
as I'm
great.
getting about it, what I'm saying though is that there isn't, it's just like chocolate versus vanilla, right? But the problem is when you've got, like I said, the empirical testing, and the problem with that, it's very subjective. I mean, we're talking about subtle spiritual effects. And it's like, I bought this talisman and 3 weeks later, my mother fell down the stairs. So I threw the talisman
I
away.
was actually just going to say
Like,
that because
eh,
we've discussed this before, how there's certainly a large degree of ambiguity and nuance and subtlety, or
though I
in
had somebody buy a third mansion talisman.
mhm.
And then that week I forget what it was. They had some kind of newspaper or text. I don't know what it said, lunar 3.
Right. I mean,
Within a
you
very close
sure,
time after. So to me,
right?
that's too focused, too synchronous. That's close enough, right? But just random bad stuff happening within the month, you know what I mean? It's like
Of
people get really
course.
nervous about that,
Sure.
or like the mailman was late, so obviously the talisman's gone bad. So blah blah blah. It's like, no, you don't need to be that nervous about it. It's like, it's just, I mean, it's funny because you're saying about like, I forget what you're, asking me about the chart for something. And I'm like, oh yeah, it was about this case that I was interested in. And I'm like, whatever. You know what I mean? I'm like, I think people have the idea that I don't even go out the door without doing an election. I'm like, no, I mean, I don't, for really important stuff, I do elections, but it's not like I'm like routinely, I have a little more faith, you know what I mean? I have a little more faith in the, in the unfolding of the universe. But on the other hand, it's like, if you want to do that, great. It's just that I think there's easy to slide into the whole superstition, which is not that astrology is superstitious per se, but you can use anything in a way that's superstitious. Like if you're using it more for reassurance and
Hmm.
there's not really a methodology to it, then that seems to be more, to me, superstitious,
Right.
So, but the real bottom line, what I would say is that there's lots of, there's not a right way to do these things. And, you want to find the one that resonates for you, and nobody can really say what that is for you. Like I said, so if you like mine, great, but if you have your own way of doing it, that's great too for you, but there's not a universally correct way to do these things.
Right. No, definitely makes sense, man. Yeah, well, let's see. I was gonna say, so, oh yeah, well, cool. Well, let's here switch gears a little bit, because, and you and I have touched on this a bunch in our talks, um, over the last year or two or whatever. But let's just put this out here again, kind of riff on stuff. So, is it meaningful or important to your mind to differentiate between spiritual or mystical paths that have kind of an eschatology or goal, meaning something like mystical attainment or the purification of the mind stream of the soul, a theurgic uh, union of some kind, or pagan and with pagan and sorceress magical paths that are more focused on conjuring and spirit work and such, and I mean, how do you conceptualize this, if you do? And
There's
mhm,
a hadith, which is a sort of what's called verified saying.
right.
In Islam, you've got a train of people you can actually look and say, well, this guy said that to this, and this guy said this of the Prophet Muhammad, that says there are as many paths as there are human souls. So everybody's on the path, everyone's on the path. And again, they say Allah has everyone by the forelock. You know what I mean? So it's like there's no one who's not on a path, right? And it's all spiritual anyway. So from one perspective, it's like there are nothing but an infinite number of spiritual paths. So to differentiate, it's like, um, but then if you're going to look at it, I mean, really, if you're talking about goals, they kind of fall into, if you're talking about following a spiritual path with a goal, then you're essentially falling into either you could call right hand path and left hand path. Right hand path is to merge with the all, right, and to lose the self, and the left hand path is to magnify the self to godhood, to divinity. And so anybody that's not having that as a goal, that's focused on the individual self and your own desires, then you could say that person's not following a spiritual path. You know what I mean? You could be using spiritual means, right? I mean, it's sort of like anybody that's doing magic is, or astrology is working with the spiritual realm in a practical way, right? But if I'm just like doing magic because I want to have sex or I want to be rich or whatever like that, then it's not, yes, using spiritual means, but I don't see that generally as a spiritual path. I mean, your goal is not, the ultimate goal. The purpose of it is basically the same thing as being a stockbroker, I mean,
Sure,
so
right. But
I don't see that that's a particular, you know, so
so surely it can be part of it, but it comes down more to intention, right?
yeah, but I mean, if you're, like I said, if I'm a typist, you know what I mean? I'm a transcriber. It's like, that's not part of a spiritual path necessarily. I mean, you can certainly be, or whatever. I'm a garbage man, it's like, but it's not explicitly spiritual means. I mean, that's where I think people get confused, is like, just because you're using spiritual means doesn't make you mean you're on a explicitly spiritual path. And so spiritual is funny because I just reading this thing from Zoller's diploma course, and he's like, which is what I probably got it from him, was saying spiritual equals psychological nowadays.
Hmm.
That's what it is. Or it just means good. I mean, I'm spiritual, so I'm good. It's just a synonym for I'm good. I don't have to feel guilty. I have a Prius, so I'm not polluting the environment. So I'm a spiritual guy, and I feel good about myself. And it's like, that's not necessarily, what I mean? There's a lot of, the language can be applied any way you want it, to do it. So that's what I would say about it, is that, but which is not to say that doing magic, that you're not a spiritual person if you do magic, or that you can't use magic in a positive way. I mean, but
Of course.
if you do a positive magic for somebody, it's the same as going out and helping them work on their garden or something. If you said, okay, I'm going to do a protective spell for you, or I'm going to do this for you, or help you.
Help heal.
Yeah,
Something.
it's healing magic. There's no difference in that being a doctor. You know what I mean? I mean, this is another problem people have, is somehow that there's a difference between spiritual and material means. Like, if I put a curse on somebody, that's the same as going over to their house with a 2x4 and beating them over the head with it. It's like, but there's this idea that, oh no, I can kind of hide behind it and more, whatever. It's not really real anyway, blah, 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 blah. And spiritual, all this sort of double talk about it. It's like, these are exactly the same. The intentionality is the same. The effect is, it's going to happen probably. And, it's just not, so that's, I think there's a lot of confusion over that. So that's what I'd say about it. But there's nothing wrong with, I mean, the thing about it is interesting, is that for a spiritual seeker, you want to seek, right? I mean, that's it's like if you have a leopard, they hunt, right? If you have a hawk, they fly, right?
Right.
And that's their function. And saying to the snake, why aren't you galloping? It's like, the snake doesn't gallop. You know what I mean? And so it's like, like I said, ultimately everything is one anyway. Rich man, poor man, beggar man, thief. And so you're just doing your dharma, and so it's like, oh, we should probably do, and that's the secret thing. Okay, I'm on the path, and I'm working really hard, and I'm gonna achieve this, and his goal is out. It's like out at the edge of the horizon there. I can sort of see it, and I'm working away at it, and I'm gonna get there one day. It's like, that's all seeker stuff, which is, again, useful at that stage, but it's an impediment. Because if you seek, you're never finding. I mean, you want to be a finder, not a seeker.
Right. Sure.
So that's what I would say about it, is it's like, it's also very American. Okay, we're got to get the job done. We're going to get everything lined up here in 1, 2, 3's checklist and start working away on it. And I'm going to work out spiritually and do it every day, and I'll get my thing going. It's like, which is, it's useful, but it's like, again, an impediment, because you're already there. I mean, all you got to do is just recognize what you really are, what's really going on, what is really in front of you. I mean, it's the face of God.
Cool. No, thanks. It's good to get your thoughts about it out there. So I'm trying to figure out how to say this, but for me, because I don't know if you remember a while ago when I kind of decided to start maybe trying to start doing an astrological practice and move out into the world in terms of putting it out there to people. I think I told you last year or whatever, my original intention was, one of the main things that motivated me was just the fact that I know so many people and having a difficult time, and people who are, maybe coming out of, maybe punk rock or that kind of subculture and stuff like that, and who have been immersed in a lot of nihilistic stuff and behaviors and attitudes, and not to knock that, but and so I thought, well, cool. And I come out of that too, right? Obviously. But I felt like maybe if I could try to maybe open some folks up to some things, and maybe things like astrology and magic and such could be ways for people to look
It's
into
like
it.
it's an expedient means. I mean, for example, there's a story about the Buddha, right? And there's a house, these children in a house, and the house is on fire. And the
Right.
Buddha realizes if he goes in and starts shouting about fire, they're just going to freak out. So he goes in, he says, you know what? There's these carts outside. You should go out and sit in these carts. These are really great. You're going to love them. They're all painted up. They're great. It'll be really awesome. And so the kids are like, oh, that sounds good. And they leave the house, right? And those are the vehicles, the
Right.
Mahayana and everything. So that's the,
Etc. Yeah.
but that's expedient means, right? He's looking at him, he's saying, so again, if you're like thinking, okay, well, astrology, because people, oh, magic, astrology, I'm kind of interested in that. I mean, that's, it's good as a kind of like, you know, kind of
As a
like
means.
as a
Yeah.
come on, so to speak. But it's like, because if you go to people and say, no, be no self, they like think you're nuts. I mean, that's
Yeah.
just like not something that's like a non-dual. You can't hit people with that stuff. You know what I mean? It's like there's only a limited number of people that are ever going to want to be interested in it. And then they're not going to be able to handle it at the outset anyway.
Sure.
So you
Sure.
wouldn't hit them with that stuff. I mean, the deeper stuff is just not something that people are going to be up for. So the problem is this, is that if you want to be spiritual and be an atheistic materialist nihilist, even unconsciously, it's not going to work. This is like this, and this is the thing: people do not want to put their feet in the water. It's like I'll do whatever I can, convulse myself in all these different ways to stay atheistic materialist. And particularly if it's unconscious. It's like I'm a spiritual person, but then if whatever. I mean, I believe in God, but it's like you don't act like it. Everything else is nihilistic. It's just following that stuff. So this is the problem: is that I think it's useful as introduction. It's interesting to people. And here's the other thing I would say about it is that when I've done 5,000 horary questions, right? And it's like, it works enough of the time that I'm like, the idea that everything's random is clearly not true. And that's useful right there. I mean, if you show people the efficacy of it, right, and it works for them, then that shows that atheistic materialism is not a valid paradigm, is not a complete explanation of reality. It's probably
Exactly.
not it's a bad model. It
Exactly.
works for certain discrete bits of reality,
Yes.
right? But as an overall view of reality, it's not a very good model.
That's
And
right.
so,
That's right. That's
so
right. And
that's
so,
something you can do with it.
yeah, yeah. And so, I mean, I'm not a proselytizing type anyway, but again, my motivation really fundamentally was to try in a way to put it out to some people as a means of, and it's a bad way of saying it, but maybe to try to engage experientially with deeper levels of reality and stuff like that. I said this to you too. I don't know if you ever read that book, In Search of the Miraculous by Ouspensky, but he quotes his guru Gurdjieff. They're talking about hallucinogens. Or someone asked Gurdjieff if hallucinogens can be of any use to in terms of spirituality, and he basically said something like, well, it could be a medicine like any other type of medicine, and maybe the best that you could say about it is for certain people, if you have a mind altering drug experience, it could open you up to the fact that there's a lot more to reality and consciousness than
Yeah, I
you
mean,
had known
it's
before.
extremely easy
Yeah.
to get. It's extremely
So,
hard to break out of the consensus reality. And the whole body-based physical reality, ethics materialism is very closed in. And so, psychedelics can be really useful for that. Um, if it ends
well,
up being something
surely,
they're just using it again and again, I mean, it's like, but you're
right.
not going to take a pill and become enlightened. There's not like the other thing about it is like you are not going to become enlightened. What you take to be you, the I that's speaking right now, is never enlightened, never has been, never is going to be, because it doesn't really exist. And so, but again, that's like, that's a little higher level understanding of stuff. So it's like everything is appropriate. Like I said, that's what's beautiful about Buddhism is it has expedient means. I mean, everything you give the appropriate, that Buddha is a great doctor and he gives the appropriate medicine to everybody depending on what their ailment is. He doesn't have a panacea that cures everybody. He's got all sorts of different things of
Right.
knowledge for everybody. So insofar as that you're like getting people interested in it, right? Sure. I mean, there's nothing, it's the same thing as having a really cool website, It's like that's going to attract people's interest. You know what I mean? It's just like the fact you come out of this punk rock background, that's going to attract people's interest. You know what I mean? All these are legitimate as a way of getting their, it's like getting their attention, but it needs to be more than that. I mean, there needs to be, there's a sizzle, that's the sizzle, and then there needs to be some steak with it. And the other thing is that, you know, some people are going to like it and some people are not going to like it.
Sure.
There's only so much you can do for people. I mean, you know, you can lead a horse to water basically. And it's like, there's only so much you can do with people, but certainly it's no problem putting it into a palatable form as long as you don't have to like, what happens is that you take the stuff and in order to be acceptable to atheistic and materialistic thought, you distort it so much that doesn't, like, I see the stuff about the brain waves of meditators. It's like, oh, they change their brain waves. And there you go. See, it's all Zen's all about meditation, brain waves, brain weirdness, chemistry.
Right.
Like that's getting distorted. You know what I mean? It's like, there is no question that the brain is connected to thinking, right? But the way I like to think about that is like, it's like, you know, someone was a novelist who said, we decided to go visit this novelist and see what the source of the novel was, right? We want to see where this novel is coming from. So we peer in the window, we see this guy and he's writing and he's typing, right? Say, the novel comes from the fingers. The fingers are producing the novel. It's the same thing with the brain. I mean, the brain, yes, there's brain waves, there's brain activity. But I saw this thing recently saying all these studies that say that, oh, when you're happy, you have this particular brain thing, they said to throw those out. It's just like, oops, it turned out to be not scientifically accurate after all.
Really?
Yeah. So they're not, there's all this mapping and shit. It's like, oh, see, we solved the problem. It's in this, you know, medulla oblongata and it's this brain wave. It's like, no, that's associated with it, but that's not the same. It's like saying love is pheromones.
Right.
Yes, when you get, you know, excited, you put off these chemicals, but it doesn't mean that the chemicals are the same thing as the experience.
Right. But then on the other hand, they also, you know, they'll point to things like brain injuries and how it alters people's personalities drastically and such.
Yeah, sure, of course. Right? It's like if I, you know, it's like, but the like I said, if I lose my arm, I'm not going to be as good at, you know, tennis anymore.
Boxing.
So it's like, okay, so what? Right. I mean, am I the same? That's one of those classic things is like, if you cut your finger off, are you still you? You know, it's like, yes. So it's like, it's not in the finger, is it? The you's not in the finger. So it's like the fact that, yes, the physical, I mean, if we're observing things, you know, physically, right? We're using these mechanisms. That's how we're sensing, right? And obviously a change in that will produce some changes. That doesn't mean that the physical is the ultimate though, right? Who's looking through the eyes?
Right.
Right. It's like okay, so I know the light comes to the retinas, right? And the retinas, you know, they're conscious of it and they send these brain impulses, electrical and chemical impulses to the brain, right? And then is there a screen in the brain? I mean, it's a brain, who's looking at it, right? That's where it gets kind of vague. And just like, but the reason they have to go to the brain is because that's the last physical link. And since there's nothing but the physical, it must be the brain.
Right. You know, speaking of brain and such, I mean, I'm wondering if the reason why, at least in the 90s or I don't know, 20, 25 years ago, 30 years ago, why C.G. Jung and Jungian psychology became so popular amongst certain kinds of folks was because of, you know, most people seem to dream or at least have awareness of dreams and such. And it seems like that is something that has intrigued people. And probably a lot of people have had things like, at least to some degree, however trivial it may be, a precognitive experience or deja vu with respect to dreams and such like that. And want to explore that kind of tradition.
I mean, I did lucid dreaming, you know,
and dream yoga.
Period where I was able to do that. Yeah. And it's like, what's nice about that is it's easily accessible for people. I mean, like you said, most everybody's dreamed. And if you think about the dream, like dreaming when you're asleep, then you can analogize that to the waking dream.
Right.
You know, this is a dream. Now it's obviously different because it's, you know, every time you wake up, there's a lot of similarities, or they think there are. I mean, that's another thing too. It's like, it's just like Sufi stuff is like that Allah is creating the universe in every moment, right? That each moment is separate. And there's just, it's like continuous. You know what I mean? There's not a carryover. It's just like zip, 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 like a cartoon. You know, you've got the still images and you run them together and it seems like there's movement and change and everything like that. When in fact, all you have is a bunch of these just moments.
Right.
So
strangely,
that's the sort of stuff you can seek on psychedelics. Go ahead.
Right. No, long ago, one of the most experienced and older and kind of most venerable magicians, meaning occultists that I knew. I once had a talk with this fellow, and we were talking about dreams, and he told me that he never remembered his dreams, and he said, I never got into Jung ever. I was never interested in it because I just never could remember my dreams at all. And I remember being really shocked by that. I was like, you're kidding me. I was like, no, man. He's like, Jung, I would read it and it just seemed so alien to me because it just didn't reflect my experience. So I was like, but well, what was there anything in psychology that you liked? And he said, yeah, I was into Lacan. I think Lacanian therapy was great. You know, so it was just really bizarre. On another note, a friend of mine, I used to have heated sort of discussions with this person long ago about debating materialism and my view. And one time she said, "Oh, well, I've had precognitive dreams. A bunch of years ago, I dreamed that my son got in a car accident, and then like 2 days later, it happened." And I said, "So what do you make of that? Of the fact that you had that dream before it occurred, with respect to your reducing things to brain functioning and neurology?" And she said, "Oh, I don't know. I figure, we have so many dreams that it's got to reflect an actual physical event at some point, I suppose." I was like, really? So it's just random.
I mean, that's what I was going to say about this,
So,
that it's not, people say, you can't prove that. And I'm like, no, you're right. I mean, all I'm doing is throwing stuff out there. And if it resonates with you, that's great.
right.
I mean? And that's what I would say about the whole, what you're talking about is like, what you do is you just like, it's like you're like a stage magician. You're just going to flourish your card tricks and everything and pick a card. And if someone is into it, they'll do it. If not, it doesn't matter. I mean, that's just like, it's everybody's dharma. It's like, that's another thing. It doesn't matter if people don't get it or not anyway. You don't need to seek.
Sure.
Just seeking is just, a seeker seeks because they're a seeker. It's like you've got wings, you fly, and it's like, but it's not better to fly than to crawl on the ground. I mean, it's like, it's all the one anyway. It's like, it's sort of like, and to be conscious of it's trippy, but it's sort of, so is a rose, what I mean? A rose blooms. It's like, oh, wow, that's amazing. Like today was an amazing, beautiful fall day, right? It's great. But doesn't mean that tomorrow, if it's raining, it's going to be worse. It's just like, these are all, just changes within the thing. So I think, like I said, there's this whole, like, the ego self is always looking for a goal and always looking for something to do and change and all that sort of stuff. And that's just, I'm afraid of this, or it's like, and it's just constantly running in place. And so it's very easy to turn the spiritual path into just another ego event, an ego path. And, that's, like I said, we live in it. It's funny because this teacher was like, oh, is so spiritually aware? I'm like, I don't think so. I think we're very unaware. I think with that the 21st century is like incredibly unspiritual. As much as the new age people try to say how we're evolved are, it's like clearly not, it's like all this horrible stuff is going on. But nevertheless, there is opportunities to do that if that's your thing. So that's what I would say about it, is it's cool. If whatever people are attracted to, to this, it's great. And I do, one of the things that for me is kind of, I'm still kind of grappling with is that, I mean, I have these various astrological, magical sort of devotional practices. I do like this daily planetary practice, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that didn't enlighten me. I mean, the Kensho experiences, the sort of enlightenment experiences that have occurred have been through the Jnana yoga path, through the direct inquiry, non-dual path.
Okay, let's back up for people who may not be familiar with what you're talking about. Can you just really concisely say something about what daily planetary practice would be and what method of inquiry is?
So daily planetary practice is basically every day of the week is astrological. That's where it came from. It's from the 7 planets, 7 days. So each planet rules a day. So the moon rules Monday, Sunday's the sun, Saturn is Saturday. So on the day of the planet, I do a quick invocation. I light a candle and some incense. I have a really short invocation that I do. And I've been doing that every day for 20 years now. So this is just sort of like, it's like a novena, that's what it is. And it's devotional. It's like, because it's not like, give me some stuff, because I will ask for stuff, but more, it's just like, I want to commune with the planets. It's sort of like a friend, you're checking in with them. And it's low intensity. So it doesn't matter how the planets are in your natal chart. And you can, I have Mars is, for example, afflicted in my natal chart, but I have no problem on Tuesday doing the Mars stuff. So that's devotional practice. The Jnana yoga, the direct pointing, this is just a particular spiritual methodology. I mean, you can, again, become, enlightened or whatever, a union through the different, like the classic Indian ones are bhakti yoga, which is devotional, like devotion to a guru, love based, um, then they have Raja Yoga, which is meditation and pranayama and breathing and stuff like that. Karma Yoga, which is like doing action. So that's the path of action, and service. Bhagavad Gita stuff. And then Mantra Yoga, there's like Tantra. Those are all sort of magical in a way, it means through ritual, through visualization, things like that. And then you've got Jnana Yoga, which is inquiry. So that's like basically like the path of wisdom. It's just like seeing very directly reality. And if you can do that, then you can become enlightened through that.
What is the inquiry for people who may not have heard of this? What is it? Is you inquiring into this
the nature of reality?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what is right in front of you? Who are you? Really? I'm Bob. And, well, really? I mean, this is, like I said, this is like, it seems it's a little bit like, a little foolish because it's so obvious, but if you think about it, it's like, wait a second, what am I? Who am I? What am I? What is being experienced right now? Because we put these, we have these sort of things of like, you're a person and you're this body and, you're I and you didn't exist and now you exist and you'll die and all this sort of framework on it. And I'm Chris and I went to this and these are my parents, all this sort of stuff. And it's like, really? When in fact, consciousness is unitary. I mean, everything is one, everything's part of the one. So it's like, that's part of being all this, but this is all crazy stuff. It's funny. Jim Carrey, he's non-dual, but the problem with him is he's a comedian and he's a little bit manic. So his delivery is manic and he's kind of like doing a kind of almost comedic. And so people think he was nuts. I was listening to him do some really good non-dual stuff. And it was like, but he comes across as being kind of crazy.
Oh, I had no idea he was
definitely
interested in anything.
Oh yeah, like definitely. He did a graduation ceremony at the Maharishi University in Fairfield, Iowa. It was very interesting.
Wow. No, I had no clue that he was into that.
But people are like, oh, he's crazy. And it's like, yeah, it does seem crazy. I mean, saying there's no self is definitely sounds really crazy to a self, because what could be more primary, is like I. So that's the whole Descartes thing. I think, therefore I am. It's like, well, as soon as you say I, then you don't need any of the rest of that stuff. Right. I'm automatically assuming that I exist,
Right. So let's talk a little bit more about dreams for a minute. So I'm sure you know that one of the primary practice in the ancient world at various times was today we would call it incubation, dream incubation, where there were sites often underground where people would go and under the auspices of a certain deity or spiritual connection, and they would try to dream to receive answers to problems or for healing for ailments or really serious diseases and such and stuff. So I was wondering if you've ever come across anything connecting astrological factors to incubation.
Oh yeah, well, I have dream talismans.
I was just going to say, and then
that's what those are. I mean, I have a sun talisman right now that we did for that. It's like there's a bunch of different things that you can make for those. It's like, and that it's exactly as you say, they're for dream incubation. I mean, they say keep it put under your bed and you dream a true dream. I've been more focusing on lucid dreaming because I think that's more. I mean, people have used it for that. I mean, lucid dreaming, I was able to do that when I first got interested in it just by put a thing on my computer saying, am I dreaming? That's, I think is, I forget the name of the author. He suggests that. And you just say, you just got in the habit of, am I dreaming? Am I dreaming? But just for me, it wasn't, the problem for me, lucid dreaming is if I remember to look at your hands in the dream, I'm like, if I'm that conscious, then I'm going to be lucid anyway. If I'm thinking about stuff like that. More, it was just if I put it into my mind, I was able to do it. Now, recently, with the pandemic, I've just been so freaked out and caught up in all this freaked out energy that I haven't been lucid at all in my dreams. But what I notice is that the level of awareness, the gross level of awareness that I'm manifesting in the dream is pretty much analogous to where I am in my waking life. Mm-hmm. So like if I'm, like I've had stuff where like saying this is a dream in the dream, and that just shows I'm pretty highly aware. in the waking life as well. But if I'm in the dream, a classic thing for me would be like, oh my God, I've got all this stuff. It's terrible. I've got to move it. I've got all these books. That's another thing. I'd have bookshelves full of books and I've got to move them. Oh, fuck, what I'm going to do. And that, again, in my waking life, I'm like freaked out with, oh my God, my job or whatever, all this stuff to do. It's like, there is no job. There's no books, right? Do I really need to worry about that? Is that something I need to worry about? Whereas if I have a dream where I'm like just kind of hanging out with interesting people doing interesting things, I mean, that's a higher level of awareness. You know what I mean? I'm not freaking out. I'm not getting into the whole dream thing as much. I'm just like, okay, I'm just experiencing this, but I'm still not aware it's a dream. I've had lucid dreams where I was like, this is a dream. And I started doing stuff. I started like, I'll put my hand through the wall. It was weird. It was like foam. I just go, I could fly a lot. I like to fly. So stuff like that. But, I haven't been able to be that lucid recently. Now, if I was, then again, it would be like, because the Tibetan stuff, they do this whole mantras and visualizations and all this sort of stuff,
Yeah,
meditation in the dream state.
Yeah, that's
but
right.
You'd have to maybe be able to maintain the aware consciousness falling into sleep.
That's right.
And
Yeah,
I'm just not able to do that. But to me, it's sort of like, like making yourself fall asleep. I mean, how do you do that? It just sort of happens, doesn't it? So, but yeah, I mean, for modern people, dreams are much more accessible because they're used to their consciousness and they can kind of deal with it. It's psychological.
sure.
But if you think about what is really happening, I mean, where is the dream taking place? In the brain? It's like, really, where? What? It's like there's a screen somewhere. There's a physical location for it. I mean, how is this actually happening? If it's brain function, like where is it? It's like, no, none of that's true. I mean, there is no physicality even now to our awareness. It's like we've created the 3D space as a creation of
Sure.
a level of consciousness.
That's right. And then maybe for people who've had dream experiences in which certain kinds of information, they were given certain types of information, or I don't want to use the word channeling, but I mean, my first astrology teacher, Jeffrey Wolf Green, I mean, most of his entire astrological system came to him in dreams, for over a period of years in Sanskrit, he said. But, I mean, in some cultures, this is far more common, obviously, but I think probably more people have some type of experience with that, dream experiences today,
book
even here.
called Commentaries in the Dream of Scipio by a guy named Macrobius, which is,
right.
What is it, like late classical, I think. And it talks, I think I got this right, is about, I think it's 5 different levels of dreams.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, there you have a couple, the first 2 levels are sort of like if you're sick, and in the dream you feel sick because you're actually, you got a stomach ache, right? So physically sick. And if your boss is hassling you, then you go to dream and your boss is hassling you, or you have anxious in the dream. Again, it's coming from your waking life. But then you have other dreams that are not from the self, that are
right.
from it seem to be external. I mean, you're, like I said, you've got dreams that are clear prophecy. And you also have dreams like, the Pharaoh had the 7 lean cattle and the 7 fat cattle, and he had to have someone interpret it for him.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it was a true dream, but only when the interpretation takes place. And then you have then you have this like direct communication sort of stuff. So what that's showing is that the consciousness that we believe we have, which is limited, right, is actually open to the all consciousness. And, you can get, I mean, obviously it would make sense if you were just one point within this huge sea that you could pick up information or whatever from other sources outside the self. So that's just, again, experience it empirically, and then maybe that's a crack in atheistic materialism. So I mean, these are all just methodologies or ways of maybe cracking that paradigm and seeing that it's, maybe it's not the, that there's maybe other ways of looking at reality. That's what I'd say about worldview, is there's many different possible worldviews. It's like, that's your reality. And again, it's not like, oh, it's better to be this. It's just like, well, it just may be your thing, though. It's a shame, like, to have a hawk in a cage. I mean, if you're not really an atheistic materialist, if you're actually a spiritual person, or, you're whatever magical person, it would be nice to be able to manifest that. But to say, I need to save the world and change these people, it's like, I know, because you're not doing that, but there is a tendency, again, to do that. It's like, that's whole new age thing. It's like, everyone's waking up, and when we have a critical mass, there'll be a rapture and we'll all be in the light. And it's like, that ain't happening. And nor should it happen. If it did happen, it's like, the Hindu thing is, Vishnu's dreaming this, right? and then every so often he falls asleep, right, and has a deep sleep, and then he dreams the reality again. It's like if everyone was enlightened, then we just have to start it over again. There's a purpose for all this stuff. It's like, because my wife's getting into that, like not to near-death experiences and people in heaven. It's like, you choose a reincarnation and stuff like that. And like they're like it's really hard. Like she's saying the earth is really hard. This material realm is extremely difficult to live in, but people still want to reincarnate.
Is it spiritualism she's getting into, sort of?
It's sort of like, I mean, she's a very sophisticated person. I mean, she's had all this non-dual stuff, you know what I mean? But this is more like, it's kind of like, I won't say exactly new agey, but it's like, like it's a reincarnation, right? So when you're in heaven, it's kind of a vacation, and if you want to reincarnate, like, okay, yeah, I'll take all that. Okay, I'll be a quadriplegic this time. I know it's difficult, or I'll be a serial killer or whatever, it's just like, I'll take that on, and you forget. I mean, this is classical too, though. It's like, drink from Lethe, the river Lethe, and then, the souls would forget their previous lives.
Exactly.
So it's not as entirely new age. It's like, it's got some antecedents, but the people that are into it are not like super heavyweight scholarly types for the most part. But I think it's true. I mean, I don't think it's like there's one way. What another thing I was saying is that it reminds me of those Star Trek episodes where the aliens appear to them in a form that you're comfortable with.
Exactly.
Right?
Sure.
It's like, this is your experience, and people go to heaven and it's got angels and, harps and clouds and shit. Well, that's their, that's the form they can accept it to.
Right.
If it's somebody else's form, that they wouldn't be able to deal with it, so, which is not to say it's false. It's just, this is the form that you can understand, that you can relate to. The
Most
interface.
definitely.
It's the interface that you're comfortable with, and
so she's getting into that area.
Yeah.
And so what has she conveyed to you about this? Like, what's
I mean, that seems to, like I said, it doesn't seem to be contradictory to reincarnation. Like the Buddhist, the Bardo, because he's also a Bardo Thotril, book of the Great Liberation through Hearing the Bardo State, called the Book of the Dead.
Sure.
But because that says you die, and then, all the elements, everything, air, fire, and water all dissolve back into their original constituents, and so your sort of astral body, basically, right, is then in the Bardo state. The Bardo of death, right? And so then you have these various visions of these different, Buddhas, right? And depending on, because see that you can go for the bright light, which is too freaky, but then there's the smoky lights, it depends on what you're drawn to. So there's the 6 realms, the reincarnated is one of the 6 realms, depending on what you like, your trajectory, right? I mean, if you're really, nasty, piggy person, you end up in the hell realms or whatever. I mean, it just depends on what what your tendencies are. You do evil shit, you're going to tend to have an evil reincarnation, not as a punishment, but because that's just the nature of it. I mean, that's what you're hanging out with.
Right.
That's the patterning that you're adapted to, that you're stuck with. And so, but that doesn't seem to me to be necessarily incompatible with going to heaven.
No, of course not. And it's funny because
especially if you mix reincarnation into it.
Right.
Seems like a break. That's the saying. I'm looking forward to the break, It's like, because I'm gonna have to reincarnate. I'm not I fucked up so many times. It's like, I'm just not in this lifetime.
We're gonna have to have a separate talk about this kind of this whole area, because this is going to be good, but I'm going to need to formulate my thoughts better about it. But one thing that just struck me now is that, it seems sometimes there's a tendency to want to frame things in too much of a linear way. For instance, regarding things like continuity of consciousness, or an afterlife, or so-called bardos and such, or spirits.
You can go too much in either direction.
Yeah.
Right. It's because,
well, I mean, like, how could that be? If you die and then you just go to a bardo, how could there be spirits left in an earthly location if the bardo is true? Like, which one is true? We have to pick. I have to pick a belief about the afterlife, because they seem incompatible to me, and I can't really take it. I can't take that.
I mean, none of them is entirely correct, but none of them is entirely false either.
Sure.
You know what I mean, it's just like, they're models.
Right. Exactly.
And so,
well, it's also mistaking like an earthly temporality, like our experience of time, like
like
that.
a location.
Yeah, like this has to be applicable. This is applicable
Well,
to
there's not really
awareness. Yeah.
materiality here anyway. I mean, like I said, the material object is not really there. If you zoom in on it enough, it's empty space. You know, it's electrons and everything like that. It's like the reason you can't, because electrons are interacting. You know, it's not because there's something there, really, right? There is something there, and it's not exactly there. It's not really physical, though. You know, the quantum mechanics teaches us. That's people like to do that quantum mechanics as opposed to like that's a good way to hang on to atheistic materialism. It's like, oh, quantum mechanics. Like they're just desperate to hang on to atheistic materialism. So they grab onto these various things. But you know, one of the things that's nice about Buddhism is that it doesn't fall into the trap of nihilism and internalism. And so nihilism is that ultimately everything's nothing, right? That's the ultimate principle is nothing. And eternalism is that you have like an unchanging, you know, eternal things, like
Sure.
a soul, for
Sure.
example. It's like this, like I was Cleopatra, then I was a donkey for 100 lives, and now I'm me. It's like what you have in the between, like, for example, if you have the one of classic analogies is a candle, right? So if a candle burns, you know, all night, and then you light another candle off of it, and then you light another candle off it, another candle off of it, is it the same flame? It's like, well, not exactly, because it's completely different candle, different, you know, material, but at the same time, there's a continuity there, right? You can't deny that there's a connection between those.
Right.
So they're simultaneously connected, but not exactly the same. And that's the thing, probably with you talking about your reincarnations, is that there's so much change at some point you can't really, you know what I mean? You could get through 1,000 reincarnations, it's probably not the same thing anymore, you know, or even less. You know what I'm saying? It's like it changes so much. But think about you as a physical thing. When you're born, you're just like a cell, right? In your mother. Are you really different from your mother? I mean, you're completely dependent on it. You're made up of cells from your mother and father, right? You know, sperm cell and egg cell, right? I mean, the egg cell's your mother, isn't it? It's coming from your, you know what I mean? So that sort of shit gets complicated. Like, at what point do you stop being, you know, when you're born, I guess, right? So, but you're unified. You are your mother. I mean, the genetic material is the same, isn't it? You know what I'm saying? So it's not even that easy. It's sort of arbitrary at any point anyway, you know? And so it's the same thing with the spiritual stuff. That's even more tenuous and you know, and easy to do, hard to deal with. But that's what I would say is that, because I've had that debate with people before about the, you know, the soul and reincarnation and stuff like that. I'm like, no, the Buddhist view is much more subtle, I think. And I think it's probably more accurate. And it doesn't fall into these either extremes of it.
Right. No, I get it. I get that. So maybe we should wrap up, but before we do, I wanted to ask you, I saw you had some new talismans, right? These new Venus ones, where you're doing more stone talismans as opposed to metal.
Yeah,
Is
you
that
know,
right? Or
yeah. So
okay.
the latest one we did, and again, it's like if anyone watches this video, you know, later, we would probably be sold out, because we had a package go missing, you know, with all the COVID stuff. And I think we lost a bunch of these talismans. So I don't have a bunch left. So we have this Venus 3 Graces, which is interesting. We'd never done this design before. Picatrix has a talisman for Venus. It says 3 people holding each other. It's good for good fortune and profit. And it's a Venus talisman, which is really odd. I mean, usually Venus would be for love or music or whatever. So profit Venus talisman was odd. So I looked at that, 3 people holding each other. I thought, you know, I should use the Botticelli's 3 Graces from Primavera, which is like super high Renaissance. I mean, Ficino, Massimo Ficino was, you know, was a big astrological magician, was supposedly helped Botticelli out with all the mythological, you know, and philosophical, you know, arrangements of that
I didn't
painting
know
in
that. Yeah.
Primavera. It's very intense, you know, allegorical painting. So the detail of it is the 3 Graces. And so we've got sort of a line drawing of that used for the talisman. So we do have the bronze and the agate. So the agate ones, we started doing just a few when we do if something that seems like it will be popular, then I'll ask Muhammad, who's the, you know, does the jewelry and stuff in Pakistan to make those. I mean, that's the problem. Shipping from Pakistan, though, it's like we do occasionally lose a package. And so super rare. But yeah, we're starting to do a certain amount of agate. I think they're laser engraved. That's what he was telling me about. Laser engraving is pretty cool.
Definitely.
A cool way to do, you can do a very intricate design on the talismans.
Right. Also, oh, yeah, before I forget, I wanted to ask you too, what can you tell me about Deneb Algedi or Algedi?
This is one of those things I don't know how to pronounce this stuff. I mean, that's one of the problems with being self-taught,
Right.
autodidact. So I have no freaking clue how to actually pronounce it. I say Deneb Algedi.
Algedi, yeah, I like that
I
actually.
don't know.
We'll
I mean,
find out.
it's funny because like Spica, because I'm from the Midwest, is Spica, whereas Nigel, who's English, would call Spica.
Right.
And then it's like Picatrix. I call it Picatrix, and people Picatrix.
Oh yeah,
Like
I've been
Picatrix,
corrected by
Picatrix.
certain individuals too
They
regarding
don't
my
fucking know how it's pronounced. And
yeah.
that's what's bullshit about that is like we just don't really know how it's pronounced, you know? And
Well, yeah, well, to me, it's a little like, I mean, if it's not really egregious, it's almost like, you know, you go to a Mexican restaurant with someone and, you know, they say, oh, can you, I'd like some more guacamole or, you know, and it's like,
yeah,
or,
Paris. I'm going to
or
Paris.
I'd really like a steak burrito. You know, I mean, unless you're Spanish speaking, but you know, you ever hang out with someone like that's a bit okay.
Well, in
Anyways,
English, it's a little, I mean, what you have is you've got stuff that as it comes into the language, it becomes, they'll become a standardized form of it in
exactly,
English.
exactly.
Um, but I mean, it's a little embarrassing because I often am not pronouncing it correctly. So it's like, I mean, a lot of the star names are Arabic, so there's probably a correct pronunciation. Now, what's funny with I'll do with a Google Translate, and you can listen to the stuff. And so it doesn't, the Arabic is like, the actual Arabic translation, pronunciation of it is not the same as what people are using either. But, it's just one of those things like, you say tomato, I say tomato. It's like,
Right, right.
that's,
But do you remember the origins, the Near Eastern origins? I think it's Sumerian or Babylonian of half human, half fish deity.
I think it's Capricorn because
Yeah,
it's a
it's a
goat,
sea goat, a sea
it's a
goat.
goat fish. So I think it's Capricorn, and
Right,
Deneb Algedi is in Capricorn.
right, right, right.
So that's what it is. I mean,
Mm,
you have a lot of these ancient deities that have animal, like a lot of the Picatrix stuff is really ancient. Like, I'm
certainly,
looking at a Jupiter image right now. It's like, a man with a head of a lion,
right.
and there's a one that you make this talisman when Venus is rising, I think in Taurus or Pisces, which exaltation, or Libra or sign. And it's a woman with the head of an eagle and the feet of a bird, you know, and which is kind of wild looking.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, I mean, this brings up for me something that I'm interested in, which you and I have talked about a little bit before, is sort of the whole topic of the what appears to be the transformation in human perception or an experience of these deities, over time, and in their really archaic forms, et cetera, going through the archaic classical period to blah 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 through the Middle Ages and all this, and how the images are transmitted, and that whole, I mean, you could write a whole
thing I would
massive.
say about that is it's sort of like it depends on what your perspective is. Because if your perspective is an academic,
Yeah,
right, then that's all you're going to want to do. I mean, somebody invented them, right? It's
right,
fictional. Someone invented it. Someone made it up. An individual person made up. It's a fiction, and they drew it or whatever, and they made it up, and then it's got transmitted somehow. Whereas the view, I mean, as a practitioner, it's like someone was asking me about that. Like they were hassling me about, well, you don't have the proper pronunciation of from in the Picatrix. And I said, that's just coming from Picatrix. It's like if they have the Arabic pronunciation of it wrong, then it's like whatever. And the other thing about it is like which kind of Arabic, right? There's all
sure,
sorts of different dialects of Arabic, and
that's right.
it's like and the transliteration was a transliteration too, because the transliteration doesn't correspond in English to what it actually sounds like in Arabic. So I was just like, whatever. I mean, if you want, I said change it. It's like change it to what you want. But I mean, I'm just going right out of Picatrix. So it's not like I did it, you know. But it's also part of this thing of like, well, the demons will destroy you if you don't address them with the proper respect name. If you get the one syllable wrong, then your head will explode. I'm like, whereas if it's Saint Joseph and you're Saint Joseph, or Saint Joseph, it's not going to fucking kill you. It's like, what are you dealing with here? So it's like, plus, it's like I said, people ask about pronunciation, and it's like we don't know. I mean, and again, it's that tacit conspiracy thing of like, well, I'll pretend to know, and you'll pretend to be, and then you can like buy into that. And I'm like, I don't know. I honestly don't know how it was pronounced. So it's like for me to say, oh, it has to be this. It's like it makes people feel more comfortable. They're reassured, but it's just because someone's confident in what they're saying doesn't mean they're right.
Of course.
But it's very bad for salesmanship to say I don't know. And that freaks people out. It's like it's far better to just bullshit them and say, oh, it's definitely this, and it has a much better sales tactics and people more comfortable. So that's why you
Well,
get a lot of, but then people
mhm.
are like, why are people lying to me? It's like, well, because you demand it. You know what I mean? If you're going to insist on this stuff, then, and I get that. I get a lot of pressure from people to, tell me the truth. It's like, I don't know, so it's like but
Well,
hopefully that's more
mhm.
valuable in the end,
Right. Well, look, I'm going to be thinking about it. Questions from the practitioner's point of view of engaging with the metamorphosis of the practitioner's experience of engaging with the living images. Maybe that'll be a way that
Yeah.
people
I
could
mean, that's what I would
understand.
say about it is that
Yeah.
really it's like, you're going to have to connect with it. And if you connect with this tradition, that's fine. But the dream stuff, you're talking about your teacher with the dream stuff. I mean, that's where I think it came from originally, the
Sure.
dreams and visions. So that to me is the most valid, you know? Um, so I think that the old stuff is fun. I love the old stuff, but I don't,
Right.
I also, I have the one thing I've done is Fomalhaut, which is a star that's a fixed star that's near a planet in my natal chart. So I felt like I had a close connection to it.
Where is
And
it?
so
What degree or of which sign? Which
it's
is it?
it's at 3 or 4 Pisces.
Okay.
So it's the southern fish. Fomalhaut
Hmm.
means the mouth of the fish.
Okay.
And so basically I sort of manifested a sigil that looks kind of like the constellation. It looks kind of fishy. It's kind of one of those, because they like to do a lot of the dots and lines connected
Hmm.
sigil stuff. So it looks kind of like a fat fish body with fins, and a tail, the
Cool.
sigil. And that's what the images of it are, of the constellation, So that's what I did. But I did a I Ching for it. I said, is this appropriate? And they're like, yes. So it was like, because I just felt like I had enough of a connection to it. You know what I mean?
And what's the
So
traditional associations with it? For
uh fame, basically, that it says you'll be renowned. And
hmm
it's got some spiritual guidance stuff too.
Cool.
So that's the one, I mean, like, that's the one actual original contribution I could make, but it's not really an original contribution
I understand.
because I didn't really invent it. I mean, I manifested it, but it's not like I came up with it.
Right.
Um, but other than that, it's like, I mean, that's how I think that, I mean, as a traditional astrologer, I respect the tradition, but I don't feel like I'm frozen. I don't have to follow it word for word. Once you get the essence, then you can start doing your own. It's like music. Once you understand the skeleton of the rhythm or whatever, you can start doing some riffing. If you change it too much, though, you're not doing it anymore.
Cool. Exactly. Yeah, and maybe it'll be okay for me to say that hopefully my new astrology site will be up and I'll be doing readings for people. It will be AK Astrology. So maybe by the time this gets posted.
Oh, cool. That's right. Because you're doing Halloween, right?
Yeah, well, it's taking a little
You're trying.
longer. So
You're
I think,
hoping that was what you were aiming for,
yeah, I
but
was aiming for tomorrow or late tonight, but I think we're going to take another week or so, but
well,
it'll be
let me
soon.
know. Let
I
me
will.
know, and I'll promote it.
Cool, cool. Well, should we call it for now?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, man. Well, good. Well, always good to talk with you.